At my sister's engagement dinner, my father said I had never built anything worth keeping. He forgot whose name was still on the land ledger. At my sister's engagement dinner, my father stood to welcome the groom's family and said, in front of 43 people, that some daughters build homes and some just learn how to criticize them from a distance. Then he looked directly at me. Half the room understood immediately who he meant. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the insult itself. The ease of recognition. The fact that he did not need to say my name for the sentence to land where he wanted it to land. We were in the private dining room of a steakhouse outside Lubbock, Texas, the kind of place ranch families choose when they want to signal celebration without looking like they are showing off. Dark wood walls, polished brass sconces, white tablecloths, cold water glasses sweating quietly under dim light. A framed painting of longhorn cattle hung over the fireplace, and someone had arranged white roses and eucalyptus down the center of the joined tables because my younger sister Hallie liked anything that looked expensive but soft. The room smelled like grilled meat, red wine, and the kind of money that rarely announces itself but expects to be understood. Hallie sat near the center, one hand resting lightly against the sleeve of her fiancé, Drew Talcott, whose family owned agricultural supply stores across 3 counties and had the posture of people who never wondered whether they belonged in rooms like that. My mother, Lorraine, sat to my father's right, in a deep green dress she wore when she wanted to look composed enough to pass for gracious under pressure. My older cousins were scattered near the far end, already laughing too easily at stories that weren't that funny, because family dinners in our world worked better when everyone agreed early on what the night was for. I was seated near the corner, close enough to be seen, and far enough to be managed. That, too, was familiar. My name is June Holloway. I was 39 that spring, and by then my family had spent years refining me into a person who sounded more disappointing in summary than I had ever been in life. Practical, but difficult. Capable, but cold. Reliable, but somehow still not warm enough to deserve the word devoted. The daughter who stayed when our mother got sick. The daughter who never married. The daughter who knew the ranch books, the irrigation schedules, the lease maps, and the tax deadlines better than either of my siblings, yet still somehow remained the one my father described as not built for legacy. Hallie, on the other hand, had always been easy to narrate. Beautiful without trying too hard. Social without looking strategic. Good at rooms. Good at softness. Good at making people feel included in her light. If I was structure, Hallie was atmosphere. Families like mine forgive atmosphere for almost anything. The dinner was meant to mark her engagement to Drew, and, unofficially, the joining of 2 local families whose names already made people sit up straighter at church and county fundraisers. That was why my father was speaking the way he was, less like a father making a toast and more like a man finalizing a merger through sentiment. He lifted his glass again after the line about daughters and homes, smiled toward Drew's parents, and said, "Hallie has always known how to turn land into life. That's a rare gift now." A few people murmured agreement. My mother looked down at her plate for half a second, which told me she knew exactly what had just happened and had already decided not to stop it. I did not stand. I did not excuse myself. I did not give my father the public reaction that would have let half the room say later that I had made Hallie's night difficult. Instead, I took one sip of water, set the glass back on the table, and looked toward the far wall where the restaurant had hung an old black and white photograph of a windmill on open land. That image mattered for a reason no one at the table yet understood. Because my father's line about homes and legacy would have played beautifully if the family story had actually been true. If Hallie really had been the one carrying the land, the house sites, the lease conversions, the quiet legal work that kept Holloway acreage from being partitioned into pieces after my grandfather died. If I really had been the daughter who hovered at the edge, offering opinions without labor. But that was not the truth. The truth was duller, older, and therefore harder to stage attractively. My grandfather had trusted me with the ranch maps when I was 26 because I was the only person in the family who understood that land does not stay in a family through sentiment. It stays through surveys, debt discipline, irrigation records, mineral rights language, widow allowances, and the thousands of unromantic details men like my father love to call office matters, until those same details decide whether the family story survives intact. For 11 years, I had done those office matters. While Hallie traveled, dated, came home photogenic, and learned how to talk about home as if love itself were a management strategy. What no one at that table knew, not Drew's family, not my cousins, not even Hallie yet, was that 6 months earlier, after my father began quietly reorganizing land parcels in anticipation of the next generation, the county title accountant had contacted me directly, because one original transfer ledger still carried my grandfather's TS conditional note and my signature as the operational custodian attached to it. Not owner, custodian. That distinction had become everything. My father had either forgotten that, or assumed no one left alive cared enough about old paper to challenge his version of events at a steakhouse dinner arranged for engagement, photographs, and family alignment. He was wrong on both counts. Because seated 2 tables away, invited by Drew's mother as a neutral courtesy for some land questions after dessert, was Marlene Sosa from County Title. Marlene had not yet said a word all evening, but she had brought a leather folder she never carried socially. And when my father lifted his glass a third time and began talking about how Hallie had always been the child who understood what should stay together, Marlene set down her fork, opened the folder on her lap, and looked at me with the expression of someone who had just realized the room was using the wrong story too confidently. That was the moment I knew dinner was over, even though no one had yet left the table. If you had asked my father which of his children loved the ranch most, he would have answered Hallie without pause. That was one of the cleaner fictions in our family. Not because Hallie didn't love it. She did, in the way many beautiful daughters love the places that taught them they belonged somewhere before the world had the chance to make them earn it. She loved the light on the south pasture in late afternoon, the smell of cedar after rain, the old limestone porch on my grandmother's house, the family photos taken by the cattle gate every Christmas whether anyone felt festive or not. She loved the idea of continuity, the image of it. The warmth people seemed to feel when they said the word home and meant land. I loved the ranch differently. I loved it in lines, easements, tax notices, water rights, cattle loss adjustments, probate delays, and the old survey copies my grandfather kept rolled in a cracked tube in the office closet. I learned early that sentiment does not keep acreage intact. Paper does. Deadlines do. So, does knowing which cousin quietly borrowed against a feed account 3 years ago, and which boundary fence actually sits 12 feet off the line everyone points to when they tell the story later? My father never knew what to do with that kind of love. He preferred love that looked outward. Love that hosted, soothed, welcomed, arranged flowers, made the porch look inhabited by goodness. My mother understood that kind of love too. Lorraine believed homes survived because women made rooms feel softer than the weather outside them. That was not wrong. It was only incomplete. My brother Clay had no interest in any of it. He left for Midland at 22 and built a life in oil services, coming home only for funerals, branding weekends, and the sort of holidays where men discuss diesel prices while women clear plates. That left Hallie and me as the daughters through whom my parents, especially my father, kept testing different versions of legacy. Hallie was the one who fit. She could walk into the feed store, remember 3 names, ask about a sick mother or a new baby, and leave with people saying she had the right touch. She knew how to ride, how to pose for local magazine features in boots that looked gently worn, how to host a fundraiser brunch in the old house without making the place feel preserved or studied. People saw her and thought continuity. They saw me and thought administration. That is not a small difference in families like mine. When I was 14, my grandfather let me sit with him in the office while he updated lease notes in pencil on a yellow pad. He taught me how to read section lines, how to compare one year's water use records against another, how to tell from a tax notice whether a parcel had been assessed lazily or correctly. I loved the certainty of it. The way land, despite all the stories people hang on it, always came back to measurements someone had to respect or pay for later. When Hallie was 14, my father took her to a charity cattle auction in Amarillo and spent the whole drive back telling my mother how naturally she handled people. That girl could keep any place alive, he said. I remember hearing it from the back seat and understanding, even then, that the family had already chosen which kind of usefulness felt prettier. At 26, after my grandfather's stroke, I moved back from Austin. That is another fact people in my family retold until it sounded like a failure instead of a decision. I had been working in commercial property administration, not glamorous, not ambitious enough for the city friends I had made there, but solid. I knew title systems, land use compliance, chain of transfer complications, and agricultural tax structuring better than anyone my age should have needed to. When my grandfather collapsed, my father told me he could manage. My grandmother called the next day and said, "Your father thinks managing is a mood. Come home." So I did. For the next 11 years, I became the person who learned exactly what the Holloway land really was beneath the family language around it. Not myth, not inheritance poetry. A layered legal organism held together partly by habit, partly by old loyalty, and partly by my grandfather's meticulous paper trail, one that began to unravel almost immediately once he was gone, and everyone else assumed love of land naturally translated into competence around it. My father loved being seen on the ranch. He did not love the books. He loved speaking at Farm Bureau dinners about stewardship and tradition. He did not love county title corrections, old mineral reservations, or the conversations required when land has to move through grief before it can move through law. So I did those too. Hallie, meanwhile, came and went with the permission always given to daughters whose future is assumed to lie partly elsewhere. She dated men who admired the ranch in photographs, worked briefly in event planning in Dallas, came home for springs and holidays, helped my mother host branding lunches, knew exactly how to arrange hydrangeas in old enamel pitchers and how to laugh at our father's jokes at the right volume. None of this made her shallow. That would be unfair, but it made her visible in the ways families mistake for indispensability. And because she was visible, my father began telling a story about continuity that moved naturally through her and around me. June handles details. Hallie understands the heart of the place. It sounded harmless at first. Then one day, it stopped being harmless. Because details are what decide whether hearts get to keep places at all. By the time my grandfather's estate was finally stabilized, 3 parcels had nearly slipped into dispute over old access language. One irrigation corridor needed reclassification, and a leased tract near the east boundary had to be restructured, so the family would not trigger tax pain no one else had bothered to forecast. My grandfather knew all that before he died. That was why he had signed one operational note, transferring custodial authority over specific land records to me, until formal family succession was completed under conditions he wrote by hand and had notarized in the county title office. That was not public family knowledge. It was legal background, which is exactly why my father forgot or chose to forget it mattered. The family story was prettier without it. Hallie could be the daughter of legacy. I could be the daughter of paperwork. What he did not understand was that paper keeps score quietly for years. And when he stood at that engagement dinner, talking about which daughter knew how to keep land alive, he was not simply insulting me. He was leaning his whole body against a version of the family that the county record had never actually fully agreed to. People who inherit land like to tell the story, as if inheritance begins with death and ends with gratitude. That is not how it works. Inheritance begins years earlier, in who learns the records, who notices the taxes, who understands what is sentimental and what is enforceable, who can tell the difference between a family promise and a county obligation, and who is still standing there when grief has passed, and everyone realizes the paperwork did not sort itself while they were praising one another's strength. That was the part I learned. After my grandfather's stroke, my grandmother moved through the first 6 months in a fog of casseroles, church ladies, and practical terror. My father handled the public side beautifully. He met people at the hospital with his jaw set, called old friends by first name, made the right solemn statements about family, faith, and how Daddy would want the place kept moving. My mother handled the kitchen, the visitors, the quiet management of who should come by and who should be told to wait a day. And I went into the office. At first because someone had to answer simple questions. Which lease payment had cleared? Which hay supplier was still waiting? Whether the irrigation service contract renewed automatically or not? Where the old survey copy for the north pasture was kept. Then, because once I was in there, it became obvious how much of the ranch had been running on one old man's memory, and a discipline no one else in the family had mistaken for tenderness until it was suddenly gone. My grandfather's office was the only room in the main house my mother never fully softened. Dark shelves, metal file cabinets, a wall map with colored pins, receipt boxes labeled in his handwriting, and an old oak desk whose drawers still smelled faintly of cedar pencils and printer ink. He had not digitized most of anything because he did not trust systems he couldn't physically lock. At 26, kneeling on the rug with chain of title copies and deferred tax notices spread around me, I understood for the first time how much of family legacy was actually just one person refusing to let small errors become expensive. For the next 11 years, I became that person. Not owner, not heiress, not the daughter whose engagement photos would someday make people sigh about how good it was that the place would stay in loving hands. The custodian, The one who knew which fence line had been redrawn after a storm took out the original markers. The one who noticed that the county's appraisal summary on the west parcel did not match the acreage carried on the old trust transfer. The one who kept mineral rights language from getting sloppily folded into lease assumptions by a lawyer my father chose because he liked him socially. That sort of labor vanishes quickly in family mythology because it is both essential and unattractive. People love to inherit what they can walk on. They rarely admire the person who protects what cannot be seen from the porch. At first, my father treated my work as temporary. June will help us settle things. June is good with these office questions. June doesn't mind that kind of thing. That last one always stayed with me. In my experience, doesn't mind is one of the most efficient phrases families use to bury a daughter alive. It turns skill into temperament. It makes labor sound like a personal quirk instead of an expenditure of time, intelligence, and life. I did mind. Sometimes. Not the work itself. I loved the work more than anyone in the family ever understood. I minded how quickly necessary labor gets reframed as emotional suitability whenever men don't want to admit dependence. The years passed that way. Property tax appeals, crop loss paperwork, oil and gas notices no one else read carefully enough, water use records, seasonal lease renewals, probate corrections, right-of-way issues with a neighboring tract, a long, stupid dispute over a fence easement that only resolved because I found an older survey note rolled inside a tube marked irrigation history. Hallie visited during some of that, helped with branding lunches, sat beside my mother at charity tables, took over floral centerpieces for the ranch fundraiser my grandmother insisted on hosting every fall even after my grandfather was gone. She loved the place sincerely. But sincerity is not stewardship, not by itself. Sincerity doesn't catch a bad transfer description before it enters county record. Sincerity doesn't know when a signature page should not be sent back until line 3 is corrected. My father knew the difference when it suited him. That is what made the later insult at the engagement dinner so useful and so false at the same time. He had spent years relying on me while speaking, as though I were simply lingering in the office because I was born with a taste for dust and forms. The truth was uglier for him. He relied on me because I was the only one in the family who could keep the land from becoming a story instead of an asset. When my grandmother died, the work shifted again. That was when family language around succession became more active. My father started saying things like, "One day this will all need a softer hand, and Hallie understands how to keep people gathered." Soft hand, gathered. It was always the same move. Reduce land to feeling. Reduce governance to personality. Make my labor sound mechanical and hers sound human. What he never understood was that I was not defending acreage from poetry. I was defending it from drift. And drift, in families like ours, never arrives dramatically. It comes through assumptions. Through dinners? Through the son-in-law everyone likes? Through the daughter who looks right standing in the yard while the other daughter has the wrong kind of dirt on her hands because hers came from the filing cabinets in the title office instead of the hydrangea beds by the porch. That was why the note my grandfather left mattered. Not because it made me powerful, because it made the record slower to romanticize. He had written, in old-fashioned formal language, that until final succession was properly structured and all conditional land obligations reviewed, operational custodianship of specific Holloway parcels would remain attached to my signature in title correspondence. Custodianship. Not sentiment. Not family preference. Not who looked most like continuity in photographs. I knew that note still existed in county title because I had seen it referenced during a parcel clarification 6 months before Hallie's engagement. My father assumed it no longer mattered because he had grown used to the family story outrunning the paper. At the dinner, as he raised his glass and praised Hallie for understanding what should stay together, what he was really praising was a visible softness built over years of invisible work he had already decided not to name unless forced. He just did not know yet that someone in the room had brought the ledger that could force it. Hallie never stole the ranch from me. That is the first distinction that needs to be made if the truth is going to stay clean. She did not forge documents, sneak into offices, or bully her way into ownership. She did something more common and, in some ways, more destructive because it was so easy for other people to reward. She learned how to stand close enough to a family story that eventually everyone around her forgot there had ever been another kind of labor beneath it. Hallie was 9 when she first discovered that adults relaxed around her. Not just family. Teachers, neighbors, churchwomen, boys with skinned knees, old men at the feed store who never smiled for me. She had a way of listening with her whole face that made people feel more generous than they really were. She could ask two small questions and leave someone feeling seen enough to say something kind about her later. My mother adored that quality because my mother believed community ran on grace and presentation in equal measure. My father adored it because charm is the only kind of management he truly understands. None of this made Hallie shallow. That is why her kind of harm is hard to explain to people who weren't there. She loved the ranch. She loved family. She loved our mother in uncomplicated ways I envied more than once. She cried easily, hosted beautifully, remembered birthdays, and could make my father feel admired without ever seeming strategic about it. What she did not understand because no one made her understand it was that a place survives through more than affection and social talent. She learned the emotional geography of the ranch and mistook that for inheritance literacy. Our family encouraged the confusion. When Hallie came home from Dallas after her event planning job dissolved in the slow, embarrassing way unstable glamorous work sometimes does, my mother said it felt like the ranch was calling her back. When she organized the fall fundraiser better than anyone expected, my father said she had June's instinct for keeping a place alive. When she started helping Drew's mother host county luncheon tables and farm bureau dinners, people said she looked natural doing it. Natural was the word everyone used about Hallie. Natural at a horse sale. Natural at a donor brunch. Natural introducing Drew to people on the back patio at Christmas. I was never called natural. I was called solid. Careful. Detailed. Reliable. Useful words. Lonely ones too. The trouble with natural daughters is that families start handing them symbolic authority long before they understand the actual machinery they are being positioned to inherit. It happens through rooms and seasons, and repeated little assumptions. Hallie started sitting beside my father more often at local dinners. He began asking her opinion on outward-facing ranch decisions, the fundraiser schedule, whether to renovate the old guest house, how the family should present itself when Drew's people came over for quail season. None of that would have bothered me if it had stayed what it was. Social positioning. But slowly, without ever saying it outright, my father began folding that symbolism into the language of stewardship. Hallie understands this place. Hallie has the right instincts. Hallie knows what matters here. That last sentence would have been funny if it had not become dangerous. Because what mattered here, in the legal sense, was not whether the linens were right in the guest house or whether the porch looked gracious when county people came by. What mattered was a patchwork of titled parcels, one conditional access road, a water rights complication near the East Line, and a set of internal family understandings my grandfather had been wise enough not to leave wholly to internal trust. Hallie did not know those things because no one ever asked her to. And when I tried, in the beginning, to teach her some of it, she listened the way people listen when they want to be good but not transformed by the lesson. At 31, she sat with me one afternoon over parcel maps and asked whether any of it really had to be this complicated. Yes, I said. Why? Because land doesn't care how family feels about itself. She laughed and said, "That sounds exactly like you." At the time, I took it as affection. Now I hear the deeper shape of it. My realism had become personality in her mind. Something accurate and slightly sad, rather than the actual condition under which the ranch still existed intact. When Drew entered her life, the problem accelerated. He was not a bad man. That matters too. Drew was decent, handsome in the broad-shouldered local way, and smart enough to understand distribution channels, commodity prices, and the value of old family names when paired strategically. He did not want Holloway land in some vulgar way. He wanted, I think, what many men like him want. Alignment. Marriage as continuity. Land as proof that a family has remained what it says it is. My father loved him almost instantly. Not because Drew was profound. Because Drew made Hallie look even more like the future. Together they had the right kind of local symmetry. Attractive, social, familiar to the right institutions, unthreatening to power. They looked like the kind of couple county magazines run in spring features under headlines about roots and renewal. That was why the engagement dinner carried more than family emotion. It carried consolidation, and that was why my father made the speech he made. He was not simply celebrating Hallie. He was formalizing, in front of Drew's family, the version of legacy he wanted the room to accept. Hallie, as the daughter who understood what should stay together. Me as the daughter who could always be thanked later for helping with the office matters while being kept at the edge of the story. What he forgot was that stories built that way stay elegant only as long as the paper stays silent. And 6 months earlier, when he began quietly moving toward next generation structuring, county title had touched the exact piece of paper he had spent years treating like dead administrative history. The note with my grandfather's conditional custodianship language. The note Hallie had never read. The note Drew's family definitely didn't know existed. The note Marlene Sosa had brought in her folder to a dinner where my father believed the land could be narrated into inheritance before anyone at the table remembered that the record had never once been written to flatter him. My grandfather never trusted family harmony on its own. That sounds harsher than he would have put it. He wasn't a bitter man. He just understood that affection and alignment are not the same thing, especially once land, marriage, and death begin rearranging the rooms. He believed in love. He simply believed in paper more when love started speaking too confidently about permanence. The operational custodianship note was written 3 weeks after his first stroke. I remember the day because he asked me to bring the Blue County Atlas from the office shelf. The old one with the split spine and the penciled corrections he trusted more than half the formal survey updates we received later. He was thinner by then, frustrated by the slowness of his own speech, but still exact. He had me sit beside him at the dining room table, while he reviewed parcel references with one finger and asked short questions about lease status, taxes, and the unresolved access issue on the southeastern tract. My father was in the room for part of it. He kept saying, "We can handle this later." My grandfather kept ignoring him. Finally, he looked at me and said, "You know where the weak joints are." That was not sentiment. It was assignment. The note itself was drafted formally by an attorney from county title, then revised in my grandfather's handwriting before notarization. It did not give me ownership. That is what my father either forgot or preferred to simplify later when he told people I was too attached to the records. The note made me operational custodian of specific land documents and transitional title coordination until full family succession could be completed under reviewed conditions. In plain language, no one parcel split, trust conversion, or family realignment touching certain tracts was supposed to move cleanly without reference to me. Again, not because I mattered emotionally most, because I knew the files. That distinction humiliates the wrong people because it reveals what they most want: blurred competence as a form of power independent of charm, gender, or familial softness. After my grandfather died, the note sat quietly in county record where most family myths go to die if someone ever bothers to pull the right file. My father treated it like a temporary legal formality, the kind of thing that remains on paper after the real moral authority has naturally returned to the patriarch in practical life. For years, because the ranch still operated and because I was there doing the work anyway, the note never had to become a public problem. That was exactly why he grew comfortable forgetting it existed as anything more than old scaffolding. Then time did what time always does. Clay stayed away. Hallie came home brighter and more marriageable. My mother got increasingly invested in the social story of continuity. And my father began, without ever saying so directly, shifting family language from "June handles the records" to "Hallie understands the future of the place." 6 months before the engagement dinner, that drift ran into county title. A western boundary tract, small but strategically awkward, needed clarification before my father could finalize a package of restructuring documents he had been discussing with Drew's father, as part of what he called long-range alignment. Alignment. Another beautiful word men use when they want to move hard consequences through a soft hallway. County title flagged the old custodianship note because one related ledger still cross-referenced my grandfather's handwritten conditional language. Marlene Sosa called me directly because she had spent long enough in title to know the difference between dead paper and deferred paper. Her exact words were, "I don't think your family realizes this note still has operational teeth." I drove into town 2 days later and met her in the records office. Marlene was the kind of woman small Texas counties quietly depend on and rarely celebrate: mid-50s, neat hair, no wasted language, a memory for transfer irregularities that made lazy men dislike her, and smart people trust her. She had known my grandfather professionally and my father socially just long enough not to confuse the two. She laid out the ledger, the note, and the parcel chain in front of me and showed me where my father's proposed structuring would have assumed a clean continuity that the record did not yet support. "He can still do some version of what he wants," she said. "But not by acting like this note evaporated because years passed and people got comfortable." That sentence explained my entire family. People got comfortable. Comfortable enough that Hallie could talk about keeping the land together at brunch and my father could nod like stewardship was a feeling rather than a record. I asked Marlene whether she had spoken to him. Not yet. Why not? She looked at me over the top of her glasses and said, because I suspected he'd rather hear a softer story first. She was right. I told my father that evening that the note still mattered. He said, only because the county likes old paper more than common sense, I answered. The county likes enforceable sequence. He waved that off, which is what men like him do when structure interrupts a narrative they are already rehearsing for public use. My mother later told me privately, you do have a way of making transitional things sound like moral emergencies. That line stayed with me because it was so familiar. My family always reduced the moment of structural risk into my tone. Not the issue itself, my tone around it. As if the danger in land succession were not bad transfer assumptions but the daughter who insisted on naming them before dessert. Marlene, meanwhile, updated the file and told me if the family wanted to use the land publicly in any new continuity arrangement, including marriage structuring, trust transition, or legacy positioning with adjoining interested parties. Someone in the room should probably remember the note existed before the wrong assumptions got printed too confidently. That was why she had come to the dinner. Not to expose my father theatrically. Drew's mother had invited her casually because, you're so good with land questions, Marlene. And Marlene, being both polite and incapable of ignoring a room built on the wrong document logic, had accepted. My father thought he was giving a toast. What he was actually doing was staking a public version of inheritance in front of a county title witness, holding the one paper that proved he had been narrating around the land instead of through it. Marlene Sosa was not the kind of woman people fear socially. That was one reason she was dangerous. If she had been dramatic, my father would have known how to dismiss her. If she had been openly combative, my mother would have framed her as difficult before dessert was cleared. If she had spoken in emotional language, half the room would have relaxed into that familiar family habit of treating any strong woman as weather rather than evidence. Marlene had none of those vulnerabilities. She spoke like county paper sounded when read aloud by someone who understood that sequence is often more merciful than opinion. I had known her since I was 19. Not intimately, the way you know the women who seem permanent in local systems, title offices, extension boards, courthouse filing windows, school finance departments, women whose names don't appear in legacy stories until something goes wrong, though those same stories would never have stayed legally alive without them. She had helped my grandfather correct a mineral rights confusion once, and later untangle an old road access discrepancy that would have cost us more than my father ever knew if she had not noticed it in time. She trusted my grandfather because he respected paperwork enough not to flirt with the idea that feeling entitled and being entitled were related. She tolerated my father. There is a difference. When she called me about the old custodianship note, she didn't make it dramatic. I think you should come in, she said. This isn't a problem yet. It's just getting close to becoming one in public language. That phrase, public language, was exactly right. The danger was not that my father had filed something illegal. The danger was drift. He had started speaking about land continuity in a way that outpaced the record. The moment family rhetoric gets ahead of county paper, someone respectable eventually has to slow the room down. Marlene was respectable enough to do it. That was why Drew's mother inviting her to the engagement dinner turned out to matter so much. Mrs. Talcott thought she was being practical and generous. She knew Drew's people would eventually need to discuss landside considerations with Holloway family property if the marriage moved toward anything more formal. Having the county title accountant at dinner felt, to a woman like that, like Prudence wearing good manners. My father mistook her presence for harmlessness. He thought title was an after-dessert conversation. He forgot that once he stood and publicly framed Hallie as the daughter who understood what should stay together, he had moved land language into the room before the paper had consented. When I saw Marlene open the leather folder in her lap after my father's toast, I understood immediately that the evening had crossed from family theater into record space. That is one reason I stayed quiet. People always assume quiet means fear or passivity. Sometimes it means discipline. If I had spoken first, the dinner would have turned emotional instantly. I would have become the unmarried sister with old wounds, the record keeper who couldn't let one night belong to Hallie, the daughter with too much attachment to procedural details. All my father would have had to do was look disappointed, and the room would have done the rest. Marlene changed the geometry. She didn't need to defend me personally. She only needed to establish that the room was using land language too confidently in front of someone who knew the ledger history. When dessert plates arrived and the conversation loosened into those soft, expensive engagement dinner clusters where women ask about venues and men begin drifting toward the first version of business once they believe the emotional centerpiece has been completed, Drew's father asked a harmless enough question. So this old place stays with Hallie's side then? He meant it casually. Or wanted to. My father answered before anyone else could. That's always been the hope. Not the truth. The hope. That was the first truly careful thing he said all evening. Marlene set down her fork. I could almost hear the room shift around that tiny sound. Then she said, "It may be worth clarifying which part of the property you mean." Silence followed in the way silence follows when someone has used the wrong noun in a room that thought nouns were still decorative. My father smiled. Clarifying? Marlene nodded. There are still conditional transfer issues attached to the original Holloway custodianship note on the south and east tracks. If we're speaking socially, that's one thing. If we're speaking as if family alignment has already resolved record continuity, that's another. She did not look at me when she said it. That was smart. It kept the issue where it belonged. Not on my hurt, but on the paper. Drew's mother blinked first. I'm sorry, she said. My father answered too quickly. Only old title housekeeping. And there it was. Housekeeping. Another family move I knew too well. Reduce the thing most likely to destabilize the story into female maintenance language. Make it sound fussy, minor, aesthetic. Marlene did not let him. Not housekeeping, she said. Operational succession. The room changed then. Not violently. Respectable people do not let rooms change violently unless they are foolish. But posture shifted. Drew stopped smiling. Hallie looked from my father to Marlene and then, finally, to me. My mother's hand tightened around her napkin the way it did whenever a room stopped being socially steerable. Marlene opened the folder. She did not fan papers dramatically or read out old legal jargon for pleasure. She removed one ledger copy, one title summary sheet, and the notarized note reference page, laying them near her water glass like documents at a working lunch rather than weapons at a trial. The original note, she said, attached operational custodianship over certain transitional parcel matters to June Holloway until succession conditions were fully structured and reviewed. That note is still active in relation to specific title references because those conditions were never fully closed in record. No accusation. No overclaim. Just sequence. That was the brilliance of it. Because once sequence enters the room, family rhetoric has fewer places to hide. Hallie said my name softly then. Not as an appeal. As recognition. For the first time that night, she understood she had not simply been standing in a flattering family story. She had been standing in front of a county witness holding the one file that could prove the story had been stretched prettier than the land ever allowed. And my father, for the first time since raising his glass, no longer looked like a man giving a toast. He looked like a man who had underestimated paper in front of the wrong witness. No one left the table. That was what made the next 10 minutes feel more serious than shouting would have. In families like mine, people know how to survive raised voices. Raised voices can be filed under temperament, stress, old wounds, too much wine, sisters being sisters. But a table that stays seated after the wrong document enters the room has nowhere easy to put what is happening. Everyone becomes a witness, and once people become witnesses, they start measuring their own silence differently. My father was the first to try to restore proportion. Marlene, he said, smiling in that tight, capable way he used whenever he wanted a room to mistake confidence for calm. I think we may be crossing streams here. This was meant to be a family dinner, not a title review. It was a smart sentence. Not because it was true. Because it offered everyone at the table a route back into comfort. Family dinner. Not title review. He was giving the room categories generous enough to protect him. If people accepted that framing, then anything further said about custodianship or conditional transfer could be made to sound like bad timing rather than relevant fact. Marlene did not take the route he built for her. With respect, she said. The streams crossed when land continuity was publicly described as settled. No one laughed. No one spoke over her. Even Drew's father, who had spent the first half of the evening leaning back in the confident posture of a man evaluating in-laws he assumed would present themselves neatly, now leaned slightly forward with both forearms on the table. That mattered. Because once men like him lean forward, the room stops being merely social. Hallie looked at my father first, then at me, then back at the copy of the ledger summary near Marlene's plate. I knew that look. She was not yet angry. She was revising. Hallie had built most of her adult life on feeling rooms correctly and moving inside them gracefully. She could sense before most people did when a narrative had gone off balance, and she was sensing it now. Not because she suddenly understood title law, because she understood, instinctively, that my father had spoken with the certainty of a man whose footing was no longer as clean as he had represented. "What exactly does active mean?" she asked. She didn't ask Marlene. She asked the table. That, too, was revealing. Because by then, she already knew the answer would not only be legal, it would be relational. Marlene answered anyway. "It means," she said, "that for certain parcels, original transitional succession language was never fully resolved in final record. The family may have operated as if the issue was functionally settled, but the county file still carries June's custodial authority in relation to specific transfer conditions." There it was again. Not ownership. Not heirship. Not a melodramatic reversal where I turned out to be the secret rightful ruler of the Holloways. Custodial authority. The exact kind of power families despise most when it belongs to the wrong daughter. Practical, boring, structurally real, and impossible to romanticize. My mother spoke then for the first time since my father's toast. Surely that's just because June has always handled the records. She meant it as softening. She landed it as confession. Because that was the point precisely. I had always handled the records, and the family had trained itself to talk about that as if handling the records were separate from carrying the land. Separate from preserving continuity. Separate from legacy. The phrase was meant to make me sound administrative, and therefore marginal. But under Marlene's calm face and the title copy on the table, it suddenly revealed something else. The entire family had depended on my labor while speaking as if my role were peripheral. Drew's mother said carefully, "I think I may have misunderstood how the ranch is currently structured." No one answered immediately. That silence was harsher than a fight would have been. Because what could my father say? That he had spoken too broadly? That family language had run ahead of title language? That his younger daughter had been elevated into symbolic continuity, while the older one was left carrying the enforceable continuity in a room none of the guests had ever needed to enter? My father tried something else. "This is all more procedural than personal," he said. "June has been invaluable. Of course, in keeping up with office matters. There are moments in your life when one sentence explains 20 years of family hierarchy so clearly that you almost feel gratitude for its bluntness. Office matters." There it was. Everything I had done, leases, parcel clarifications, tax structuring, probate corrections, access disputes, conditional succession review reduced into office matters, as if the land somehow lived elsewhere in purer form, and I had merely typed around its edges, while more lovable people inherited its soul. Hallie flinched at that. Just slightly, enough that I saw it. Because she was beginning to understand the scale of the fraud even though no fraud, in the legal sense, had occurred. My father had not forged the county. He had not lied in record. He had done something subtler and more socially rewarded. He had told the family story in a way that assigned emotional ownership to one daughter and structural labor to another, then pretended the emotional ownership was the truer inheritance because it played better in rooms. I finally spoke. Not loudly. Not because I had planned a sentence. Because leaving the table entirely to my father at that point would have been another form of labor. "The land isn't separate from the records," I said. "That's the whole point." Everyone looked at me. I continued before anyone could soften it into tone. "You can't praise continuity in public and call the actual continuity office matters in private. If the title note still matters, it matters because the family has been relying on the work it attached to me, while talking as if that work belonged to atmosphere instead of structure." No one moved. I could hear the kitchen doors opening and closing somewhere beyond the dining room wall. A waiter passed the entrance, saw the room, and kept walking. My father said my name in warning. "June," but the warning had no authority left in it. Marlene did not look at either of us. She looked at Drew's father and said, "To be clear, there's nothing scandalous here. This is a title continuity issue, not a dispute of affection. But if the family is speak publicly about what stays together through Hallie's line, then the family should first finish the conditions attached to what June has been carrying on paper." That sentence saved the room from spectacle and stripped my father of his last useful escape. Nothing scandalous. No crime. No overclaim. No humiliation fantasy. Just proportion. That is what made it devastating. Because no one could dismiss the correction as emotional excess. Marlene had not attacked my father. She had not crowned me. Hallie looked at me again then, and this time there was no revision left in her face. Only the beginning of shame. Not because she had stolen anything. Because she had stood too comfortably inside a version of family life that asked too little about what it cost someone else to keep it standing. And once she saw that, the engagement dinner could no longer return to what it had been at 7:32, when the roses were still fresh and my father believed a toast would be enough to secure the emotional transfer of legacy. The room had become too accurate for that. No one announced that dinner was over. That is the strange thing about respectable collapses. They rarely arrive with a single dramatic sound. More often, the room simply stops cooperating with the original script. After Marlene's clarification, the energy at the table changed in three visible ways. First, Drew's family stopped treating the evening as a celebration and started treating it as a source of information. Second, my mother stopped trying to smooth emotionally and began trying to contain procedurally. Third, Hallie went quiet. That last change mattered most. People like to assume the charismatic daughter cannot recognize structure once it appears. That isn't true. Hallie recognized it almost immediately. What she had never done, what our father and mother had spared her from doing, was follow it all the way down to what it implied about the rest of us. Drew's father asked for water. Not because he was thirsty. Because men often buy themselves time through objects when they need to think in public, without looking like they are thinking in public. My father, meanwhile, made one final attempt to reduce the scale of the issue. "Let's not turn old custodial language into a family trial," he said. "June has done a tremendous amount for all of us. No one is denying that." There it was again. Praise as minimization. Tremendous amount. For all of us. The sort of sentence that sounds generous until you notice that it still refuses to name the work accurately enough to disturb the hierarchy built on top of it. I said nothing. That mattered too. At another age, I would have felt compelled to explain, to produce examples. To say, "I'm not talking about thanks. I'm talking about the structure by which the Holloway place still exists as one thing." I would have reached for clarity quickly because women like me are trained to believe delay looks like weakness. But by then, I had learned something harder and far more useful. Once the right record enters the room, overspeaking only helps the people who depended on blur. So I let silence do part of the labor. Drew's mother asked, "Was Hallie told this explicitly?" That was the first morally serious question anyone outside the family had asked all night. Not does June have rights. Not is the ranch in danger. Not how embarrassing this must be. Was Hallie told? Because that question moved the evening from appearance into knowledge. Who knew what? Who was protected by not knowing? Who benefited from a version of legacy made softer and prettier than the enforceable one? Hallie answered before anyone else could. "No," she said. Then, after a pause that felt older than the room, she added, "Not like this." My father looked at her sharply. "Hallie, there's no need to make this bigger than—" She cut him off. "Dad, stop." It was not a loud interruption. Hallie did not have my voice for that. But she had the one thing I rarely had in our family. The power to sound hurt in a way that immediately unsettled our parents more than any argument ever did. She turned toward Marlene. "If I'm hearing you right, then June has been carrying the actual transitional authority, while the rest of us have been talking as if that was already just sentimental background." Marlene, to her credit, did not soften the language. "I'd say June has been carrying the operational side of continuity, while the family has spoken more freely than the file supports." That sentence landed on my father harder than anything else had yet. Because the family sounds collective, but everyone at the table knew which member of the family had just spoken most freely in public. My mother finally tried a different tactic. "Perhaps," she said, "this is something the Holloways should review privately before more assumptions are made." Again, a smart sentence. Again, too late. Because privacy was what had allowed the imbalance to mature in the first place. Privacy had let my father treat me as necessary, but narratively secondary. Privacy had let Hallie inherit atmosphere, without being forced to ask what sat under it. Privacy had let my mother call my work stabilizing while silently preferring that the stabilizer never become central enough to disturb the family's prettier self-portrait. Drew spoke for the first time then. He had been mostly silent all evening, which I had initially read as caution. I realized now it was assessment. I don't think anyone here is trying to embarrass anyone, he said. But if June's role is structurally real, then it should have been part of how this family talked about the future. He was looking at my father when he said it. That mattered enormously. Not because Drew was suddenly my champion. He wasn't. He was protecting his own family from entering an alliance under false assumptions. But truth spoken for self-protection can still be truth, and in some ways, it travels farther than truth spoken for justice. My father sat back for the first time all night. That small movement did more than any apology could have. It meant the room no longer belonged to him. The joined tables, the roses, the expensive steakhouse, the Talcotts, the cousins, the old ranch story, all of it had been arranged around an assumption that he could narrate Holloway continuity into place by speaking confidently enough. Now the table was being governed by something he could not out-host or out-father. Sequence. Marlene slid one of the documents across toward Hallie. Not the full note. Just the title summary page, with the cross-reference to my grandfather's custodial language. Hallie looked down at it for a long time. Then she said, almost to herself, "You never told me." She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at our father. That was the moment the evening stopped being about my humiliation and became, finally, about his convenience. Because Hallie understood, then, what had really happened. My father had not merely underestimated me in public, he had protected her from the weight of what continuity actually cost, while still using her publicly as the visible daughter of continuity. He had given her a flattering inheritance, and given me the enforceable one, then praised her for softness and me for utility, as if these were natural rather than arranged. No one touched dessert. No one asked about the wedding date again. No one mentioned flowers, or registry plates, or Drew's mother's idea for a spring brunch. The room had become too exact, and once a room becomes exact, family theater starts looking what it has often been all along. A way of moving burden, while keeping beauty in the right daughter's lap. After the dinner broke apart, Hallie asked me to meet her the next morning at the old office on the ranch. Not the house. The office. That detail alone told me the night had done more than embarrass her. It had shifted the category of what she thought needed understanding. People go to the house for feelings. They go to the office for sequence. I got there just after 8. The sky was pale and hard, one of those West Texas mornings where the light comes early but warmth takes its time. The old office stood where it always had beside the equipment shed. White paint gone soft with dust, the tin roof still humming faintly from wind. I had opened that door thousands of times over 11 years, and knew by smell alone whether the season had turned paper, cedar, old leather, printer ink, sun-baked dust. Hallie was already inside. No makeup. Hair tied back. My grandfather's old legal pad open on the desk in front of her, as if proximity to his paper might somehow make her understand faster. She did not greet me with softness. "That was new too," she said. "Why didn't you tell me it was this much?" There are questions that sound accusatory but aren't. This was one of them. It sounded instead like someone trying to locate the point where her life diverged from the truth, and not liking what that search was revealing about the people she trusted most. I closed the door behind me and said, "I did tell you pieces." She looked down. "I thought you meant paperwork." There it was. Paperwork. The family word for labor that keeps land alive, while allowing everyone else to treat the real inheritance as emotional scenery. I sat across from her and let the silence breathe for a few seconds before answering. "It was paperwork," I said. That was the problem. Everybody kept saying paperwork as if paper was separate from the ranch. She took that in slowly. Then she asked, "Did Grandpa mean for you to have it?" I knew what she meant. Not the title. The future. The rightness. The moral center of legacy. "No," I said. "He meant for me to hold the vulnerable part until the family could be trusted to sort it honestly." She flinched at the word honestly. Not because it was unfair, because it opened the right wound. We spent the next hour in the records. The custodial note. The parcel chain. The Southeast Tract issue. The water right corridor. The reasons my grandfather had been cautious about attaching symbolic succession language before the family could agree on actual obligations. Hallie read more slowly than I do, but more deeply than I expected once she stopped trying to be reassured. That is something I will say for her now with real respect. When she finally realized comfort was not the same as understanding, she did not ask me to translate everything back into metaphor. She let the hard language stay hard. At one point she said, Dad made it sound like you were guarding the office because you liked being needed. I almost laughed, but the sound didn't come out as humor. No, I said. Dad made it sound like I liked being difficult because it was easier than admitting he liked being protected. That was the line that changed her. Not all at once. Human beings almost never change all at once. But I watched something in her settle into a new order. She had loved our father in the trusting way younger daughters sometimes do, the way girls love men who praise their softness and mistake that praise for clear sight. Sitting there with title summaries and old notations spread across the desk, she finally understood that our father had not merely favored her. He had used her image of continuity to avoid naming what continuity demanded from me. Around 10:30, she found the handwritten note my grandfather had added in the margin of one survey copy, not part of the notarized custodial language. Just his hand, blue ink, slanted and stubborn. June sees where the land breaks before the rest of us do. Do not let charm outrank that. Hallie stared at that sentence for a long time. Then she sat back and covered her mouth with one hand. Not crying. Not yet. Just seeing. That note, more than the legal language, broke the family story open. Because my grandfather had not simply trusted me administratively. He had recognized the exact family weakness that later flowered into the engagement dinner humiliation. Charm outranking structural truth. Hallie was not the target of the note. Not exactly, but she was the space through which the family had been letting charm do too much moral work for years. She said. He knew. Yes. And Mom knew too. Yes. That was the harder recognition. My mother had known enough to benefit from the arrangement even if she had never admitted it to herself in those words. She preferred Hallie as visible continuity because Hallie made family identity feel beautiful. She preferred me in the office because I made beauty enforceable without requiring the room to admit dependence too plainly. Once Hallie understood that, the engagement dinner stopped being a single bad night. It became evidence. Not of villainy. Of a structure. She asked me finally. What do you want now? That was the question none of them had asked at the steakhouse. There, they wanted stabilization, containment, a way to put the paper back under the story without admitting the story had grown dishonest. Here, in the office, with our grandfather's notes open between us, Hallie was asking something else. Not how to save face. What I wanted. I told her the truth. I don't want the room rewritten to worship me instead. I don't want revenge. I want the family to stop speaking as if continuity has a face and not a burden. And I want anything involving your marriage, Drew's family, or future land structuring to be accurate before it becomes social. She nodded slowly. Then she said, Dad's going to hate that. Yes. He'll say you're making everything colder than it needs to be. Yes. She let out a breath that could almost have become a laugh if either of us had still been in the kind of mourning that allowed laughter. Then she said, that was the first fully adult sentence I had ever heard my sister say about our father. And once it was said, the rest of the family had less room left to hide in. My mother called the meeting for Sunday afternoon and insisted it be at the house. Of course she did. She still believed difficult truths could be made more bearable if the room looked right while they were spoken. She had the dining table cleared, fresh flowers in the blue pottery pitcher, blinds half open to let in the soft kind of ranch light magazines love, and coffee set out before anyone arrived. It was her old method. If beauty entered first, maybe reality would agree to lower its voice. It didn't. Present were my father, my mother, Hallie, me, and, at Hallie's request, Drew. That last choice changed everything before we even sat down. Because Drew was no longer simply the fiancé being welcomed into a family romance about continuity. He had become an outside adult with a material interest in whether the family understood its own structure honestly. My father could no longer rely on the old indoor voice of Mercer Holloway mythology. There was a witness now who wasn't born dependent on it. My father opened badly. I think this whole thing has been inflated beyond common sense. That was his first sentence. No apology. No correction. No acknowledgement that he had used an engagement dinner to reduce me publicly, while overplaying Hallie's symbolic authority in front of Drew's family. Just inflated. Beyond common sense. At another age, I might have argued with him immediately. Instead, I watched Hallie. Because this meeting was no longer mainly about whether my father respected me. It was about whether Hallie would allow herself to become the prettier branch through which the family kept smuggling distortion into the future. She did not let him. No, she said. What's inflated is the story you've been telling. I watched my father actually blink. Not because Hallie had disagreed. She'd disagreed before in smaller, daughter-safe ways. But because she had done it without tremor, without tears, and without offering him a bridge back into paternal dignity first. My mother stepped in. "Hallie, let's not." "Mom, please," Hallie said. "You knew enough to know this wasn't just June being attached." That sentence hit my mother harder than anything I had said to her in years. Because daughters like Hallie are not supposed to take the older daughter's side against the family aesthetic. They are supposed to remain the softer proof that harmony is still possible, if everyone would just stop making such sharp distinctions between labor and love. Drew said very little, which I respected. When men like him speak too early in rooms like that, they often recenter themselves as arbiters of a family they barely understand. He did something smarter. He listened until the old patterns became visible enough that anyone with a functioning moral sense could tell where the real issue sat. My father turned toward me and said, "No one has denied what you've done." That was another one of his old moves. Translation by gratitude. Reduce a structural issue into whether I had been thanked enough. Make the conflict emotional and interpersonal rather than material and narrative. It is one of the cleanest patriarchal tricks in the world. I answered, "This has never been about thanks." Then Hallie added, before he could interrupt, "It's about how you keep calling June's work support while speaking about me like I'm continuity." Silence followed. That silence mattered because it held the whole room in the right shape. My father could not call Hallie bitter. He could not call her unmarried, difficult, office-minded, or too attached. She had always been his witness for softness. Now softness had named the pattern. My mother tried one last time to rescue the atmosphere. "We all love this family," she said. Drew finally spoke. "I don't doubt that," he said. "But love doesn't answer title notes, and it doesn't tell me how I'm supposed to step into this without walking on top of something you've all let June carry alone." There it was. Again. Not a speech, not a hero line. Just a man refusing to let marriage flatten facts into charm. My father stood then and walked to the window, hands on his hips, looking out toward the south pasture, as if land itself might restore the moral geometry of the room. But land never does that. People project poetry onto it because poetry does not ask for corrected signatures. When he turned back, the fight had gone out of him, though not the pride. "I never meant to erase anybody," he said. It was the nearest he had come to honesty. Because I believed him. That was the tragedy. He had not set out to erase me. He had simply spent years preferring the version of inheritance that let him feel like a father of beauty, not a father dependent on the daughter who knew where the weak joints were. I said, "Intent isn't the measure here." He looked at me then, with a kind of tired anger I recognized well. Not rage at being contradicted. Anger at having to think in a language he had avoided long enough that now it sounded like accusation. "What do you want?" he asked. The whole house seemed to go still, because that was finally the right question. Not what will make you calm down. Not what do I need to say. Not can we move on. What do you want? I answered carefully. I want all future land conversations to reflect the actual title structure. I want Hallie and Drew to go into marriage with clean information instead of family mythology. I want the custodial note resolved properly, not socially ignored. And I want us to stop speaking as if continuity is the daughter who photographs well with the porch behind her. No one cried. That also mattered. This was not a healing television scene. It was harder and better than that. A room where the family finally had to choose between beauty without sequence and a colder, more durable version of truth. My mother looked at the flowers in the pitcher as if they had failed her. My father sat back down. And once he did, the room stopped belonging to the old story. The practical changes came first. That was how I knew the meeting had mattered. Families can survive one honest conversation without changing anything if the conversation stays emotional enough. Tears are easy to metabolize. Atmosphere recovers. People apologize just enough to restore the arrangement they were already in. But this time, because Hallie had asked the right questions, and because Drew had refused to marry into a romance built on inaccurate land language, the family did something rarer. It moved paperwork. Within 2 weeks, Marlene coordinated a formal title review session. Not at the house, not around a dinner table, at County Title, where fluorescent lights make everyone sound less poetic and more accountable. My father hated that. My mother disliked it almost as much because there is no floral arrangement in the world that can make a title office feel like grace. But they came. So did Hallie. So did Drew. And for the first time in my adult life, the family sat in one room where my kind of knowledge was not treated as mood, inconvenience, or office temperament. It was simply the thing the room needed if it wanted the land to remain legible. The review did not turn me into owner. Again, that distinction matters. I refuse stories that reward the overlooked daughter by making her secretly sovereign all along. Life is usually less theatrical and more exact than that. What happened instead was cleaner. The old custodial note was formally acknowledged. The unresolved conditional language was reviewed. The South and East tract succession pathways were clarified, and future transfer conditions were rewritten to reflect actual operational history rather than the softer family assumptions my father had been using socially for years. My signature stayed where it belonged until the resolution was complete. Then it was released properly. That mattered more than if it had remained there forever, because I did not want symbolic victory. I wanted the record to stop flattering the wrong story. Hallie changed too. Not all at once, not perfectly. She and Drew delayed the engagement party extensions my mother had already started discussing, and instead met twice with Marlene and once with the family attorney to understand what was actually attached to any future residence, decisions, trust alignment, or parcel use, near the old South House site. Hallie stopped using phrases like, keeping the ranch in the family so casually. Once you understand the labor beneath a sentence, the sentence stops sounding harmless in your own mouth. We did not become suddenly close. That would have been too easy and, frankly, false. But something harder happened. She stopped using me as emotional contrast. She stopped letting our father narrate me as the daughter of office dust while she sat in the role of continuity unexamined. At a church fundraiser in June, when someone told her she was the one carrying your mama's homemaking heart into the next generation, Hallie answered, "That place stayed whole because June carried the legal side of it for years. I just got to look like I belonged there." It was the most honest public thing she had ever said about me. I didn't thank her. She didn't need thanks. She needed proportion, and she had finally given some back. My father became quieter after the title review. Not warmer. Not transformed. Quieter. He did not apologize in the full sense. Men like him rarely do when apology would require admitting not just one bad sentence, but an entire worldview built on the wrong daughter doing the unadmired work. What he did instead was smaller and, in some ways, more believable. He stopped speaking publicly about which child understands the land. He stopped making little jokes about my taste for paperwork. He started asking before assuming. Once, at the feed store, I heard Hiffy tell a neighbor, "June handled the structure when Daddy passed. We'd have been in a mess without her." It was not enough. It was also the truest thing he had ever said about me to another man. My mother's shift was sadder. She never fully stopped mourning the prettier story. That is the only honest way I know to put it. Lorraine loved the house version of Legacy, the women gathering, the daughter in the right dress on the right porch, the feeling of continuity more than the document weight of it. She accepted the title correction because she had to. She even acknowledged, one evening while clearing coffee cups, that perhaps she had let usefulness become invisible because invisibility made family life run more smoothly. That was as close to confession as she knew how to come. I did not push her further. Not because she did not owe more, but because by then I had stopped trying to turn every partial truth into a total one. Adults often change along the grain of their original limits. My mother would never become a woman who loved record truth as much as social beauty. But she did stop pretending the beauty could keep standing alone. As for me, the greatest change was quieter than all of that. I stopped explaining. Not in the bitter, in the disciplined one. I stopped translating my work into softer words so other people could keep their innocence. I stopped letting, "You know how June is," do the work of reducing a life into temperament. I stopped believing that if I delivered one more graceful clarification, one more careful emotional bridge, one more rounded explanation of why structure matters, my family might finally learn to admire it without needing it first to save them. They admired it after it saved them. That was enough. Not emotionally. Structurally. And structural truth, I learned, lasts longer than family weather. People like endings, where the overlooked daughter either inherits everything or walks away forever. Life is usually less flattering than that and, if we're honest, much more useful. I did not take the ranch. I did not win the land. I did not expose my father as a criminal, ruin Hallie's engagement, or turn a steakhouse dinner into a public revenge sermon. I did not need to. That would have turned the whole thing into a different, uglier story, one where injury demanded spectacle in order to prove itself. What I chose instead was smaller. And because it was smaller, it held. The title issues were resolved by late summer. The custodial note was closed properly. Future parcel language was clarified. Hallie and Drew married in October in a service at the Old Methodist Church, not out at the ranch house where my mother had first imagined it. I attended. Sat in the third pew on the left. War, Navy. Signed, the final continuity release 2 weeks before the wedding, and did not mention it to anyone outside the title office. Marlene, Hallie, Drew, and the attorney. That mattered. Not because secrecy is noble, because not every truth needs to be staged to become real. Drew and Hallie now live in Amarillo. Not on the land. That, too, turned out to be part of the mercy of the whole mess. Marriage did not become a symbolic takeover of the ranch. It became what it probably should have been all along. A marriage. They come out on holidays, help at branding, sit on the porch with our parents, and leave before the place can start turning them into mythology again. My father still runs too much of the day-to-day for a man his age. My mother still places flowers in the hallway like beauty might keep the years from sounding so administrative. Clay still comes home mostly for practical male occasions. The ranch remains what land almost always remains after the family drama cools. Fields, fences, taxes, weather, and the next ordinary problem already waiting in the wings. As for me, I stayed where I had already been close enough to help, far enough not to dissolve. A year after the engagement dinner, I formed a small consulting practice in land transition administration for multi-generational agricultural families who had exactly the problem ours had: too much symbolic inheritance, not enough structural honesty. Water rights, succession maps, contingent parcel review, family trust alignment, no poetry in any of it, which is precisely why it matters. I named the practice Red Ledger, because old land remembers in red ink long after families stop wanting to. The work suits me. It is quiet, specific. Daughters who have been carrying books and easements for 10 years while their brothers are still praised for stepping up. Fathers who mistake warmth for continuity. Families who think love should be enough and are always stunned when county language asks harder questions. Sometimes I tell them the truth gently. Sometimes I let the records do it. That depends on the room. Hallie and I speak more honestly now than we ever did before. Not frequently. Not sentimentally. But honestly, a few months after the wedding, she sent me a photo of the porch at dusk with no message attached. I understood what it meant anyway. Not apology exactly. Recognition. That she still loved the image of the place, but no longer mistook image for stewardship. I sent back a picture of the old ledger drawer after I finished reorganizing it. She replied, "That looks more like inheritance than any family photo we ever took." She was right. My father and I have reached something narrower than peace and more useful than comfort. He no longer praises Hallie in ways that erase me. He no longer jokes about office matters. Once, in late winter, while we were both standing by the barn watching a storm roll in, I said, "Land doesn't stay soft. Families just prefer stories where someone else handles the hardness." He nodded. That was enough for that day. Not all fathers change into wiser men by the end of these stories. Mine didn't. He just lost his easiest lie. Sometimes that is the most adulthood a family gets. See, if I've learned anything worth keeping from all of it, it is this. The person who carries the record is rarely loved for carrying it while the room is still beautiful. They are loved later, quietly, after the weather turns, after the transfer gets complicated, after somebody realizes the family story had been leaning harder on invisible labor than anyone wanted to admit. That used to break my heart. Now it doesn't. Not because the unfairness vanished, because I stopped needing beauty to be the proof of value. At my sister's engagement dinner, my father said some daughters build homes and some just criticize them from a distance. He was wrong in the oldest way men like him are wrong. He mistook the visible daughter for the preserving one. What I had been building all those years was not a house, not a porch, not a romance of continuity. I had been building the conditions under which the family could keep speaking of home without the county eventually correcting them in public. That work is not pretty. It is also not shameful. And I no longer let anyone call it office matters, when what they really mean is that they were glad someone else knew how to keep the story from falling apart before the paper did. That is not bitterness. That is proportion. And after a lifetime in the wrong role at the right desk, Proportion turned out to be the nearest thing to peace I ever actually needed.